January 17, 1945. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The snow fell in silence, not the gentle, nostalgic silence of a winter's evening back home, but the heavy, suffocating silence that comes when the earth itself has been beaten into submission. Corporal James Whitlock crouched behind the shattered stump of what had once been a towering spruce, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. His hands, red and raw despite the wool gloves, gripped the M1 Garand rifle with a familiarity, born not of military drilling, but of something older, something learned in the fields of Iowa, where he'd spent 17 years before the war knowing every contour of his father's Winchester, like it was an extension of his own arm. Around him, the forest was a graveyard of trees. Artillery had turned the Hürtgen into a landscape of splinters and mud, where every shadow might conceal a German position and every sound might be the last thing a man ever heard. The 28th Infantry Division had been fighting here for weeks, grinding forward yard by terrible yard, and the cost had been unspeakable. Whitlock's platoon had started with 42 men. Now, huddled in the frozen darkness, they numbered 18. In his pack, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, was a photograph. His mother standing beside the barn, the Kansas wheat stretching golden. Behind her, he hadn't looked at it in 3 days. Superstition, maybe. Or perhaps he simply couldn't reconcile that world of abundance and sunlight with this realm of frozen death. The Garand lay across his knees, and he could feel the veterans watching him. Johnson, the squad leader from Brooklyn, Martinez from El Paso, Harper, who'd been selling insurance in Philadelphia before all this. They'd seen him cleaning it that morning, the meticulous way he'd field stripped the rifle, checking every component with the patience of someone who'd grown up maintaining equipment. That meant the difference between a harvest made and a family going hungry. Harper had laughed not cruelly, but with the weary cynicism of a man who'd seen too many replacements arrive with romantic notions about their weapons. Farm boy and his dear rifle, Harper had muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "Thinks he's gonna win the war with that thing." Whitlock hadn't responded. There was nothing to say. They were right to be skeptical. He was 19 years old, had been in combat for exactly 11 days. It looked like he belonged behind a plow rather than a rifle. 6 feet tall, but lean in the way of men who'd grown up with work rather than recreation, with a face that hadn't yet learned to hide fear behind the mask of experience. The Garand, this 8.5-pound semi-automatic rifle that the Army had issued him, was the most sophisticated piece of machinery he'd ever been trusted with, and yet it felt less foreign to him than the half-tracks and radios and all the other mechanical miracles of modern warfare. What the veterans couldn't know, was that Whitlock had been shooting since he was 7 years old. Not for sport, not for glory, but for necessity. Crows threatening the corn, coyotes stalking the chickens, the occasional deer when winter pressed hard and the family needed meat. His father had taught him the old way: breath control, squeeze, not pull, respect for the ammunition because every cartridge cost money they couldn't spare. By the time Whitlock was 14, he could hit a running rabbit at 70 yards with iron sights, and had learned to make every shot count because wasted bullets meant wasted dollars. The Garand, to him, was simply a tool, a magnificently engineered tool. Yes, John Garand's masterpiece of semi-automatic reliability, the first standard-issue semi-automatic rifle adopted by any military in the world, but still, fundamentally, a tool for placing bullets where they needed to go. 300 yards ahead, through the skeletal remains of the forest, the German machine gun position waited. To understand what happened in those next 7 minutes, one must first understand what the German soldiers expected. By January of 1945, the Wehrmacht was fighting a defensive war on all fronts, their grand dreams of conquest having collapsed into a desperate struggle for survival. The soldiers manning the MG-40 to position in the Hürtgen Forest were not the triumphant warriors who'd swept through Poland and France. They were exhausted men, fighting with dwindling supplies against an enemy whose industrial might seem inexhaustible. But they still held advantages. The Hürtgen's terrain favored defense-dense forests that nullified American armor, narrow corridors that turned into killing zones, prepared positions that had been reinforced over months, and they had weapons that, on paper, outclassed much of what the Americans carried. The MG-42 machine gun could fire up to 1,100 rounds per minute, a rate so high it produced a sound like tearing fabric, a sound that had earned it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized concentrated machine gun fire massed, overlapping fields of fire that could shred infantry advances. Against this, the American infantry came equipped with a rifle that many German soldiers initially viewed with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. Intelligence reports had filtered through the Wehrmacht about the Americans' standard infantry rifle, the M1 Garand, semi-automatic, yes, each round and block clip, gas-operated, but still just a rifle. The Germans themselves had experimented with semi-automatic rifles, the Gewehre 41, the Gewehre 43, but had never fully replaced the bolt-action Karabiner 98K as their standard issue. Semi-automatic rifles were complex, prone to malfunction, difficult to manufacture in the quantities modern warfare demanded. There was something else, too, a cultural prejudice that ran deeper than tactical assessment. The German military tradition prized discipline, precision, coordinated fire. The idea that individual American soldiers, each with a semi-automatic rifle, might represent a fundamental shift in infantry combat hadn't fully penetrated the Wehrmacht's institutional thinking. Americans, from the German perspective, relied on material superiority rather than skill. They had more of everything: more tanks, more artillery, more supplies. But man to man, soldier to soldier, the Wehrmacht still believed in their superiority. This belief was about to be tested. Whitlock had been studying the German position since dawn. The MG40 Tennis was well concealed, built into a natural depression, and reinforced with logs and frozen earth. He'd spotted it not through any flash of muzzle fire, but through absence a small patch of forest that looked undisturbed, to perfectly positioned to command the approach his platoon would have to cross. 3 times during the morning, he watched the subtle movement of a helmet shifting position, the brief glint of metal that might have been a barrel adjustment. The platoon's plan was straightforward in the way military plans often are, deceptively simple in conception, murderously complex in execution. They would advance into groups. The first squad would move down the left flank, drawing fire and fixing the German position in place. The second squad, Whitlock's squad, would attempt to flank right and close the distance. If they could get within grenade range, they might be able to neutralize the position without calling in artillery that might or might not be available, given how overstretched the entire division had become. Johnson, the squad leader, gathered them in a shell crater as the gray winter light strengthened. He was 26 years old and looked 50, with eyes that had seen too much and a voice that had gone flat from giving orders that sent men to their deaths. Martinez, you and Phillips take point. Harper, Wilson, you're with them. Move. When you hear first squad engage, don't bunch up. If you get pinned, stay down and wait for us to flank. Whitlock, Johnson paused, looking at the farm boy with his too clean Garand. You stay with me. If things go sideways, I want someone who can actually shoot straight. It wasn't encouragement. It was the pragmatic calculation of a man trying to keep as many of his soldiers alive as possible. But Whitlock nodded, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or simply the mutual acknowledgement of men about to test themselves against death. The first squad moved out at 08 for 7 hours. The sound of their movement was swallowed by the forest boots, crunching in snow, equipment creaking, the small sounds of men trying to be silent and failing. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. Then the forest erupted, the MG40 to open up with its characteristic ripping sound, that impossibly fast rate of fire that seemed less like individual bullets and more like a solid beam of destruction. Whitlock heard screaming, heard Johnson shouting into the radio, heard the sharp crack of M1 carbines returning fire, and then Johnson was moving, and Whitlock was following, and the world narrowed to the immediate, the next tree, the next patch of cover, the weight of the Garand in his hands. They covered maybe 60 yards before the second machine gun opened fire. There were 2 positions, not one, but 2, a primary gun and a supporting position 30 yards to its right, each with interlocking fields of fire. The Germans had set a trap, and the Americans had walked into it exactly as planned. Harper went down first, taking 3 rounds through the chest before he even understood what was happening. Martinez ducked behind a fallen log and found himself pinned, unable to move forward or back. The forest had become a slaughterhouse. But word spread among the American infantry grinding through the Hurricane. The story circulated with the speed and elaboration that combat stories always do. A farm boy from Iowa, not Germans with 9 shots, probably not exactly true soldiers. Are poets, not accountants but true enough to matter. The Garand, which some had still viewed as merely a marginal improvement over bolt-action rifles, began to be seen differently, as something more than a standard-issue weapon, as an equalizer, as the embodiment of a particularly American approach to warfare. The Germans noticed too. Intelligence reports from captured documents and interrogations revealed a growing respect, grudging, bitter, but genuine, for the American rifle. A Wehrmacht tactical manual captured in February 1945 included a revised section on engaging American infantry. Enemy riflemen equipped with semi-automatic rifles demonstrate significantly higher rates of accurate fire than anticipated. Engagement ranges should be increased when possible. Single American soldiers can suppress entire squad positions if allowed to establish firing positions. That last sentence represented a conceptual shift. A single soldier, not a machine gun team, not a specialized sniper, an ordinary infantryman with a standard-issue rifle. This was the democracy of firepower that M1 Garand represented. James Whitlock survived the Hurricane Forest. He survived the final push into Germany. He survived the war. When he returned to Iowa in November 1945, he brought back his Bronze Star, a Purple Heart from a wound he received in March, and his Garand purchased from the Army through a program that allowed veterans to keep their service rifles for 53 years. That Garand hung above the mantel in his farmhouse outside Ottawa. He never shot it again, never cleaned it, never even took it down except once, when his grandson, 8 years old and fascinated by history, asked about it. Whitlock had held the rifle for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight, and then carefully returned it to the mounts. It did what it was supposed to do, he told the boy. That's all. He died in 1998, and the Garand went to his grandson, who donated it to the Smithsonian. There it sits now, in a climate-controlled case in the National Museum of American History. A small placard noting its service with the 28th Infantry Division. 17 notches are carved into the stock, of practice officially discouraged, but privately common among soldiers who needed some way to process what they'd done. 17, not 9. The Hurricane Forest was Whitlock's first major action, but not his last. The MG-42 that had anchored the primary German position was never recovered. When the Americans withdrew from the Hurricane in late February, the campaign, having cost over 33,000 casualties for minimal strategic gain, they left behind most of what they couldn't carry. The forest swallowed the weapons and the fortifications and the bodies. Today, 79 years later, hikers in the Hurricane still occasionally find remnants of rusted helmet, shell casings, fragments of equipment slowly returning to Earth. But the story survived in military academies. The M1 Garand's role in World War II is studied as a case study in technological advantage and doctrinal innovation. The decision to equip every American infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle represented an investment not just in machinery, but in human potential. It reflected a belief that the common soldier, the farm boy, the factory worker, the shopkeeper's son was capable of effective independent action if given the tools. This was not universal among military powers. The Soviet Union mass-produced submachine guns, but kept bolt-action rifles as standard issue. The British maintained the Lee-Enfield bolt-action throughout the war. The Germans, despite their technological sophistication in tanks and aircraft, never standardized a semi-automatic rifle. Each of these choices reflected underlying assumptions about the nature of combat and the capabilities of the individual soldier. The United States chose differently. They chose the Garand, and in frozen forests and desert wastes and Pacific islands. That choice expressed itself in moments like the one James Whitlock experienced, moments when a single soldier with a superior tool could shift the tactical balance of an engagement. There is a photograph in the 28th Infantry Division archives, taken 3 days after the engagement at the German machine gun position. It shows a group of soldiers resting in a captured bunker. Whitlock is there, third, from the left, his Garand propped against his shoulder. He's not smiling. None of them are smiling. They have the exhausted, hollow-eyed look of men who've been in combat too long, who've seen too much, who've lost friends and killed enemies and survived through some combination of skill and luck that they don't fully understand. But something else is visible in that photograph. If you look closely, a subtle shift in posture, in the way the other soldiers position themselves relative to Whitlock. Not the exaggerated hero worship of propaganda, but a quieter form of respect. The recognition that this young man with the Iowa drawl and the methodical manner had demonstrated something valuable, that he could be counted on, that his tool, so derided and dismissed, had proven itself when it mattered most. The Garand weighs 9.5 pounds. Its effective range is 500 yards. It fires .3006 Springfield ammunition at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. These are facts, measurable and objective, but its true weight cannot be calculated on a scale. Its true range extends far beyond the flat of any bullet. When John Garand designed his rifle, he was trying to solve a mechanical problem: how to create a reliable, powerful, semi-automatic weapon suitable for mass production and use by soldiers of varying skill levels. He succeeded brilliantly. The rifle worked. It worked in the frozen forests of the Ardennes and the baking sands of North Africa and the humid jungles of the Philippines. It worked when caked with mud, when soaked with seawater, when fired until the barrel glowed hot. But its success transcended mechanics. The Garand became a symbol of something larger than industrial might and technological sophistication. And of the United States, yes, but also a particular vision of democracy expressed through material means. Every soldier armed with a Garand represented an investment, a statement that the individual infantryman mattered, that he was worth equipping with the best available tools, that his skill and judgment were valuable enough to enhance with superior firepower. German soldiers, when they first encountered the Garand in North Africa and Italy, had tried to understand it through their own doctrinal framework. It was a good rifle, certainly, but rifles won battles through discipline, massed fire under tight command control. Individual marksmanship was less important than unit cohesion and tactical coordination. They were right about many things. Unit cohesion did matter. Tactical coordination was crucial. But they were wrong about the rifle being just a rifle, because the Garand wasn't just a weapon. It was a force multiplier that shifted the mathematics of small unit combat. It gave every American soldier the firepower that other armies concentrated in specialist weapons. It allowed initiative at the lowest levels, permitting individual soldiers to seize tactical opportunities that bolt-action rifles couldn't exploit. In the Hürtgen Forest on that frozen January morning, James Whitlock had exploited such an opportunity. He hadn't called in artillery, hadn't waited for air support, hadn't relied on superior numbers or coordinated maneuver. He'd simply seen a problem, applied a solution, and executed with the precision learned from years of necessity shooting. In Iowa fields, 9 German soldiers died because of the Garand semi-automatic action. They died because Whitlock didn't have to manually cycle a bolt between shots, didn't have to break his sight picture, didn't have to lose precious seconds that would have allowed them to react and return effective fire. The machine gun crews, confident in their fortified positions and their own weapon superiority, had underestimated what a single American rifleman could accomplish. They weren't the first. They wouldn't be the last. In the decades after World War II, the lessons of the Garand influenced small arms development worldwide. The concept of a standard-issue semi-automatic or automatic rifle became universal. The Soviet SKS and AK-47, the Belgian F-Enfel, the German G3, the American M14 and M16 all reflected the understanding that individual firepower at the infantry level was not a luxury, but a necessity. The era of the bolt-action rifle as a standard military weapon ended, in large part because the Garand had demonstrated a better way, but something was lost too. The M14 and M16 that replaced the Garand were lighter, held more ammunition, were in many ways more effective weapons, but they lacked something intangible: a weight, a presence, a sense of craftsmanship that the Garand embodied. John Garand had designed his rifle at a time when skilled machinists hand-fitted components, when tolerances were measured with calibers and experience, rather than computer-controlled machinery. The Garand feels like it was made by humans for humans. Its weight is substantial, but balanced. Its action is smooth, but with a satisfying mechanical precision. Even its distinctive ping when the en-bloc clip ejects has a musical quality that soldiers remember decades later. James Whitlock, in the interviews he gave reluctantly in his later years, always returned to this. The Garand, he said, felt right. It felt like a tool you could trust. And in those moments when everything depended on the rifle working exactly as it should, that trust was everything. He never spoke much about the Germans he'd killed. When pressed, he would only say that they were soldiers doing their duty, same as he was, that the war had put them in opposition. And in such oppositions, someone had to prevail. That he didn't hate them then and didn't hate them in memory. They were simply the enemy, and the enemy had to be defeated, and the Garand had allowed him to defeat them. But once, near the end of his life, he said something that his family remembered. He was watching a documentary about the war, and a segment came on about weapons technology. The narrator was discussing the Garand, showing footage of soldiers firing it in training. Whitlock watched quietly and then said, almost to himself, "They gave us a chance. That rifle gave us a chance. When you're out there, it's just you and them, and everyone's scared and nobody knows. If they'll see tomorrow having a tool that works, that you can depend on, that doesn't let you down, that's everything." That's the difference between coming home and not coming home. The documentary moved on to other topics. Whitlock sat in silence for a while, and then rose and went outside to check on his fields. The Iowa corn was growing tall that summer. The same corn his father had grown, the same corn his grandfather had grown. The continuity of it, the endless cycle of planting and harvest, seemed to provide some measure of peace that no amount of medals or recognition ever could. The philosophical question at the heart of the Garand story is this: what does it mean to arm every soldier as if they were exceptional? Because that's what the United States did. They didn't reserve the best weapons for elite units. They didn't create a hierarchy where specialists got automatic weapons while ordinary infantry made do with lesser equipment. They gave everyone the Garand. This represented a profound faith in the average soldier. The farm boy, the factory worker, the clerk, the student each was trusted with a weapon that could, in skilled hands, dramatically affect the outcome of small unit engagements. Each was expected to develop and apply marksmanship skills. Each was given the tools to exercise initiative and capitalize on tactical opportunities. Other military systems didn't make this assumption. They organized around collective strength: the machine gun squad, the mass rifle volley, the overwhelming barrage. Individual soldiers were components in a larger system, valuable primarily as parts of a coordinated whole. The American system trusted individuals to be more. Not always. Not every soldier was James Whitlock, but the system was built on the assumption that many soldiers could be, if properly trained and equipped, that the infantry wasn't just a mass to be directed, but a collection of capable individuals whose cumulative initiative could achieve objectives that rigid hierarchical systems could not. This was, in a very real sense, democracy applied to warfare. Not democracy as political philosophy, but democracy as practical faith in human capability. The Garand was the mechanical expression of that faith. When German soldiers surrendered to American forces in the final months of the war, they often asked to examine the Garand. Some did so with professional interest. These were skilled soldiers assessing a competitor's equipment, but others did so with something approaching wonder. Here was a rifle that every American soldier carried, not rare, not restricted, standard issue. The implications were staggering. The industrial capacity to produce millions of such rifles, the training infrastructure to teach millions of soldiers to use them effectively, the logistical system to supply ammunition for weapons that consumed it at 3 times the rate of bolt-action rifles. But beyond the material implications was something deeper, a different vision of what a soldier could be. The Germans had built their military around specialization in elite units: the Fallschirmjäger, the Waffen-SS, the specialized assault engineers. These units received the best equipment, the most training, the toughest missions. Regular Wehrmacht infantry were capable, certainly, but they were not expected to be exceptional. The Americans seemed to expect everyone to be exceptional, or at least to give everyone the tools to be exceptional if they had the skill and courage. The Garand was the physical manifestation of that expectation. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, where James Whitlock earned his Bronze Star, is remembered today as one of the United States Army's costliest battles of World War II. Over 3 months, from September 1944 to February 1945, American forces suffered approximately 33,000 casualties, attempting to clear a 50-square-mile area of dense forest along the German-Belgian border. The strategic value of the forest was questionable. The tactical gains were minimal. Military historians generally regard the battle as a failure of high-level planning, a meat grinder that consumed entire divisions for objectives that could have been bypassed. But for the soldiers who fought there, such strategic assessments were abstract and distant. Their war was immediate, personal, brutal. It was measured in yards gained and friends lost. It was the weight of equipment through freezing mud, the terror of artillery strikes that shredded trees into flying splinters, the exhaustion of weeks without adequate rest or resupply. In that context, the Garand was more than a technological advantage. It was a companion, a tool that worked when everything else was falling apart, a reliable constant in a world of chaos and death. Whitlock's experience was repeated, in different circumstances and with different details, tens of thousands of times across every theater of World War II. A soldier in a difficult position, facing superior numbers or better positioned enemies, prevailing because his rifle gave him an edge, not a decisive edge, not a guarantee of survival, but a margin small, precious, sometimes life-saving that bolt-action rifles couldn't provide. The aggregate effect was profound. American infantry units, properly led and supported, could engage and defeat larger German or Japanese forces with greater consistency than pre-war planning had anticipated. The reasons were complex: air superiority, artillery support, logistical abundance, tactical doctrine. But the Garand was part of the equation, an important part, perhaps the most democratically distributed part, because every rifle squad had 8 men with 8 Garands, and each of those men had the potential to be the one who made the difference. The Germans understood this. Eventually, they were tactical. Manuals emphasized the danger of American rifle fire, the importance of not allowing American infantry to establish firing positions, the need to engage at longer ranges or with greater concentrations of automatic weapons. They adapted, as skilled professional soldiers always adapt, but adaptation is an admission of challenge. The Wehrmacht had expected many things from American forces: overwhelming material superiority, relentless artillery support, command timidity that prioritized casualty minimization over aggressive action. What they hadn't fully anticipated was that every American infantryman would hit the battlefield with a weapon that fundamentally changed the tactical calculus of small unit combat. That was the Garand's true victory, not any single engagement, not any individual soldier's feat of marksmanship, but the cumulative effect of millions of soldiers armed with a tool that amplified their capability and rewarded their initiative. There is a moment, frozen in Whitlock's memory, that he described only once. It was in 1994, during an oral history interview for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. The interviewer had asked him about fear, whether he'd been afraid. During the engagement at the German machine gun position, Whitlock had been silent for a long time. Then he'd said, "I was terrified, before, during, after. Terrified in a way I'd never been and hope never to be again. But the rifle..." He paused, choosing words carefully. The rifle didn't care. It didn't care that I was scared. It didn't care that men were dying. It just worked. I pulled the trigger, and it fired. I loaded a clip, and it chambered the round. It was this island of reliability in the middle of hell, and I could hold on to that. I could focus on that. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. As long as the rifle kept working, I had a chance. This was the soldier's truth about the Garand. Not the technical specifications or the doctrinal advantages, but the psychological anchor it provided. In combat, where everything is uncertainty and terror and chaos, a reliable weapon becomes something more than a tool. It becomes a connection to training and skill and normalcy. It becomes proof that some things still work, still make sense, still respond to discipline and correct application. The Garand provided that anchor for hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. It wasn't perfect. The end-block clip made reloading slightly slower than detachable magazines. The weapon was heavy compared to later rifles. The distinctive ping of ejection theoretically revealed when a soldier had run dry, but it was reliable. Brilliantly, consistently, remarkably reliable. Soldiers trusted it, and in combat, trust is survival. When German soldiers captured Garands, and they did, occasionally, from battlefield casualties or supply mishaps, they often kept them for personal use rather than turning them into armories. This was unofficial and risky, as using enemy weapons could result in being shot by your own side in the confusion of combat. But some soldiers took that risk, because the Garand was simply a better rifle than what they'd been issued. This was the ultimate tribute. Enemy soldiers, raised in a system that emphasized German technological superiority and trained to view American soldiers as materially advantaged, but individually inferior, recognized excellence when they handled it. The Garand spoke for itself. In the photograph that hangs in the 28th Infantry Division Museum in Pennsylvania, Whitlock is standing with his rifle, his face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, his eyes looking somewhere beyond the camera. He was 19 years old in that photograph, but looks older. War does that burns away youth and replaces it with a hard-won understanding that the world is more terrible and more precious than anyone who hasn't experienced combat can fully grasp. The museum guide, when showing visitors this photograph, tells the story of the 9 German machine gunners. The details have evolved over 7 to 9 years. Sometimes it's 11 machine gunners. Sometimes Whitlock was wounded during the engagement. Sometimes the range stretches to 300 yards. The truth is less spectacular, but more meaningful. A young soldier, properly trained and properly equipped, confronted an impossible situation and did the impossible. Not because he was a hero in the mythological sense, not because he was fearless or superhuman, but because he had skill and courage and a rifle that worked. The Garand gave him the tool, training gave him the knowledge, fear gave him urgency, but he supplied the willingness to rise up when every instinct screamed to stay down, to aim carefully when speed seemed more important, to trust his ability when failure meant death. This is what the Garand represented, ultimately. Not automatic victory or guaranteed survival, but the enabling of human capability. It was a rifle that rewarded skill, that amplified training, that turned the average soldier into someone capable of extraordinary things. Every military in history has sought this, the weapon that would grant decisive advantage, the tool that would tip battles in their favor. The Garand didn't do this through revolutionary firepower or radical innovation. It did it through something more subtle and more powerful. It made every soldier more capable. It democratized lethality. It gave the farm boy from Iowa the same firepower that other armies reserved for their elite. And on a frozen morning in January 1945, in a forest that had become a graveyard, that democracy of firepower expressed itself in the most fundamental way. One soldier, one rifle, 9 enemies defeated, not through superior numbers or better position, but through superior equipment properly applied. The Hürtgen forest today is peaceful. The trees have grown back, not the ancient spruces that artillery destroyed, but newer, growth, vigorous and green. Hiking trails wind through terrain where men once fought and died. Occasionally, a rusted helmet or shell casing surfaces, reminders of the violence that consumed this place. Visitors walk these trails, most of them unaware of the specific battles that raged here. The Hürtgen has become, for most people, just another world war, a battlefield, tragic, certainly, but distant. The veterans who fought here are nearly all gone now. Their stories persist in archives and museums and the fading memories of children who are themselves growing old. But the Garand remains in museums and collections and private homes. Hundreds of thousands of Garand still exist. Some are pristine display pieces. Others are working rifles, maintained by enthusiasts who appreciate their history and craftsmanship. Each one is a testament to John Garand's genius, yes, but also to the soldiers who carried them, the farm boys and factory workers and shopkeepers, sons who took this 18.5-pound tool to war and used it to defend freedom. That word freedom seems abstract and overused today, but for the soldiers of World War II, it was concrete and immediate. They were fighting against systems that had rejected individual worth, that had subordinated human dignity to state power, that had attempted to organize the world according to hierarchies of race and nation and ideology. The Garand, in its own way, was an answer to those systems. It said that the individual mattered, that the common soldier, properly equipped, was valuable, that democracy, messy, inefficient, trusting in the capability of ordinary people, could produce tools and systems that totalitarianism could not match. This is romantic, perhaps. The Garand was designed by engineers, manufactured in factories, issued according to logistical requirements. It wasn't conceived as a philosophical statement about democracy, but symbols acquire meaning through use, and the Garand acquired profound meaning in the hands of the soldiers who carried it. When James Whitlock raised his Garand in that frozen forest and began to fire, he wasn't thinking about democracy or philosophy or symbolism. He was thinking about survival and duty and the men depending on him, but his actions, multiplied across millions of soldiers and thousands of engagements, created a truth larger than any individual experience, the truth that the common man, armed and trained and trusted, could prevail against systems that viewed individuals as expendable components. The truth that a democracy willing to invest in its citizens could create tools and methods that aristocratic military traditions could not overcome. The truth that the farm boy with a deer rifle was exactly the warrior that modern warfare demanded. In his final interview, given 6 months before his death at age 73, James Whitlock was asked if he had any regrets about his time in the war. He thought for a long moment, staring out the window at the Iowa fields he'd spent his life farming. "I regret that it was necessary," he finally said. "I regret that young men had to die American, German, all of them. I regret that the world was broken in such a way that violence became the answer. But do I regret what I did? No, I did my duty. The rifle helped me do it, and maybe, in some small way, I helped end the war a little sooner. If that saved lives American or German, then it was worth it." He paused, then added, "The rifle is in a museum now. Good. People should remember, not glorify, but remember what it took to defend freedom. Remember what was risked and what was lost. Remember that ordinary people, when they have to be, can be extraordinary." The Garand above his mantle was gone by then, donated to the Smithsonian, but his presence remained in the stories he'd finally started telling, in the lessons he'd passed to his children and grandchildren, in the quiet pride of a man who'd done something impossible when it mattered most. That is the legacy of the M1 Garand, not the technical specifications or the production numbers, but the human stories it enabled, the moments when ordinary soldiers, faced with impossible odds, prevailed because they had a tool that worked and the courage to use it. In museums across America, Garands rest in glass cases, cleaned and preserved and silent, but in memory and history they still speak. They speak of John Garand's genius and American industry's might. They speak of training camps and rifle ranges and the patience of instructors teaching farm boys to shoot. They speak of frozen forests and desert wastes and island beaches where young men confronted evil with nothing but courage and a rifle in their hands. And sometimes, if you listen carefully enough, they speak of a January morning in the Hurricane Forest, where a 19-year-old from Iowa proved that the farm boy with the deer rifle was exactly the warrior that freedom needed. The Garand gave him the chance. He did the rest. And in that conjunction of tool and skill and courage, something larger than any individual was expressed: the democratic faith that every person, properly equipped and properly trusted, can rise to meet the moment when history demands it. That faith, as much as any bullet the Garand fired, was America's gift to the war. And in the end, it proved sufficient.